Nice segue, as if we had planned. Thank you, Claudia. Because you mentioned Italy, I feel like I have to start with something Italian. So let's start with the Italian general election. You know, the Italian general election saw the League, the former Northern League, the extreme far-right party, polling 17.69% of the vote. The populist five-star movement polled 32.2%. And the populist 32.2% was, of course, based on part economic populism, national minimum wages, etc., etc. But it was also based on a promise to end the Mediterranean rescue boats. It was a normalising of an anti-migrant narrative that's run right through Italian politics, where mainstream politicians talk openly about deporting up to 600,000 migrants in Italy. And of course, if that sounds familiar, well, it is familiar, because look in Germany, where we have a neo-Nazi party, the first time since 1945, a neo-Nazi party, 13.5% of the vote, is in the German parliament. And it's likely, if there is another general election in Germany, then the neo-Nazis will poll higher than the Social Democrats. It's very, very likely. At the moment, the neo-Nazis poll more than the Greens and the left combined, right? And you see, of course, in France with Le Pen, in Finland with the True Finns, in Austria with the Freedom Party. The story is again and repeated again and again and again. And of course, we only need to look across the shores to the US, where we have a white supremacist in the White House. And what binds all of these people is, of course, a very, very similar playbook, right? They're all using the same argument, roughly, which is, of course, there's a crisis, economic uncertainty and austerity on one line, and then you have this othering of people and you blame the other and say that's where your economic ills come from, right? And of course, we see it also here in the UK, right? In the Brexit debate. Now, that's not to say those people who voted to leave were all racist, but I would say pretty much every racist voted to leave, right? Because also the same issues in terms of the narratives around race and migration came to play in the Brexit debate, which is why we have some of the highest rates of racist incidents again, last seen since the 70s and 80s, a normalising of anti-migrant narrative, not just against the so-called migrant community, but against all black people, and that's always been the issue in there, and how this plays out. Now, we're told by the media and even by politicians, it's understandable. It's understandable. You have to understand why people feel this bit of uncertainty, and so therefore we have to normalise it. Well, actually, no, we don't, right? And that's part of why this issue about climate migration is really, really important, because it operates on a number of different levels, right? So, of course, on one level, there is no legal protection and no legal definition of who is a climate migrant or a climate refugee. There is, right? There isn't. And of course, we all know that the current convention, the Refugee Convention, is very, very clear about who can seek legal protection underneath that, right? And that's for civil and political, everybody knows that. And of course we know that the governments of the world would like to, if they possibly could, to trash that as well. And most of them undermine it on a daily basis. So that's absolutely the reality. And we know also that the reality is that only a small percentage, of people who are migrants or refugees ever make it to the global north, right? The idea that Europe is facing a migrant crisis or a refugee crisis, when people talk about 1 million or 1 million plus people, when the reality of what migration and the impacts of migration happen in poor countries and between poor countries, because that's where the largest scales of migration are taking place. So why we talk about climate refugees and climate migration is, of course, yes, there has to be legal protection. And it goes back to not just what's happening now, but when you look at, for example, the Institute of Migration, the International Organization of Migration, which is the UN body, it talks about 1 in 30 people in the world being displaced from their homes by 2050. That And that scale of people being displaced from their homes. Now, and when we look at those patterns of migration, as I said, the overwhelming patterns of migration, wherever you look, and you can look in sub-Saharan Africa, you look in the Maghreb, you look at South Asia, of course, people have very varied patterns, right? Nobody moves instantly. People try and temporarily ride it out. There's temporary movements of people, usually internally in a local area. People try and move back. They're constant this thing. And then a situation happens where people can't. And there's a really fascinating study where people mapped out what happened when there was sea level rise in Bangladesh. And they mapped out that over time, how communities were displaced. And then people were forced ultimately into Dhaka, into the main city, and into the slums. And the women ended up being in the garment industry. Non-unionised, shittest, cheapest jobs. And the men, then, in the next stage of migration, because they're unable to survive, are forced to migrate out of Bangladesh and first into India. And they make their way all the way to the big cities, and they end up in the construction industry. And then from there, they end up in the Gulf. And it's an incredible pattern when you look at what's happening in terms of migration. And it's the same story. When people say, oh, those are economic migrants, you know, all these people coming across from the Mediterranean, when you look back at where people are coming from, they're coming from the places in the Sahel, where there has been a drought, where 3.5 million people have been displaced. They're coming from places in the Horn of Africa where climate change is exasperating every other single inequality that exists, has impact on water resources, on people's rights, and people are forced to move. And of course, patterns of migration have always been communities club together, families club together to try and send one person, and the one person try and get there. What? Because if they can get somewhere, largely always still in poorer countries, if you can get to the West, that maybe that will bring you some economic stability in one way or another. I'm going to come back to that. And I think one of the things that what we have to do in terms of the climate, when we talk about climate refugees and we talk about what we're trying to do, yes, it's talk about legal protection, absolutely. People should have legal protection. And that legal protection is not simply about legally in the sense of it's only about protection. It should be also about recognising that legal protection means economic protection. That it's no good saying to people, you can't, we'll be okay, you'll be okay, nobody will kill you, if you're saying, at the same time you're saying it's all right that you can starve to death from hunger, right? It's important for us to talk about what does protection actually means, and it means social protection and economic protection as much as it means in terms of legal protection. The second thing we have to do is we actually also have to talk about the right of people not to move, right? The demand should be people shouldn't be forced to move. And that brings us back to some of the issues that we were talking about in the plenary. That means when we talk about climate refugees, have to say it's also about the impacts of our corporations, right? It's about the tax havens and the illicit funds going out of the global south. It's the fact that we take 6.5 times more money out of Africa than we give into aid. The fact that India alone gave £400 trillion to the British economy during the empire, right? It's about the fact that over centuries, countries in the global south have been impoverished. Now, if we think that doesn't make a difference, this country ground to a fucking salt over 2 inches of snow, right? Over 2 inches of snow, and the country ground to a halt in London. London couldn't move. Why? Trains had to be cancelled earlier. Now look at the devastation in Dominica, right? Where 2 years ago, just one storm 2 years ago, wiped out development gains of 10 years. Where when you go to Dominica now, when you see the pictures of a whole island totally devastated, or when you're in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, which killed 7,000 people, made 2 million people homeless, that only 2% of homes have been rebuilt. Only 2% of those people are back in homes. The majority of people are forced into temporary camps, migration with families, with other communities. So the idea of the right not to move is a fundamental right that we have to protect, and it has to be part of our argument. And of course, it's the point you were saying, People always talk about open borders, and I remember in the 80s, we were like, open borders was our answer to the immigration, into the draconian immigration laws of it. And it's absolutely right that we have to talk about open borders. But we talk about open borders, not simply that open borders is the answer, right? Now I recognise it, principally it's really important. But there is a power that lies in the open borders. All of us, presumably in this room, you know, we all carry probably the same colour passport. So we could all collectively now get up, get a tube, get to Heathrow, and we can go to 186 countries without a visa. 186 countries. Our passport will let us go. So, and we know that the reality is that if you're from Africa, if you're from South Asia, if you're from many places in the global south, you will never be able to cross those borders, not because of the colour of your passport. And of course, we also know that within all of us going, there are some of us, bright brown faces, who will also carry our passports on our faces, right? So we may have a certain colour passport in our pocket, but we also have a different colour passport. So we know that there are disparities in terms of power and privilege that exist. But it's simply also a question, when a citizen in Europe, or in the UK, or in the United States, has an average income of $55,000 in the United States, or, you know, tens and tens of 35,000 in Europe, and a resident of Mali has an income of $750 for the year, it's your economic wealth that also matters, that determines whether you can cross a border or not. It's not simply by making the call open borders that it's the answer. It's about our ability to be able to use that power. And that's why tackling economic inequality has to be part and parcel of our fight around migration. Now, we all see the pictures, right? We have all seen the pictures of the Mediterranean, men, women, children drowning, 5,000 plus last year, every single year increasing. And, you know, and they're horrific, absolutely horrific pictures, and they get worse every single year. And we know that, you know, what used to be talked about as being the fringe far right used to talk about, you know, let's push the boats back, we have to stop the migration patterns, we have to make these deals, now is normal. When Tony Blair talks about it, when the European Union makes agreements with Morocco, when countries are making agreements with Libya and with Sudan and Egypt about moving our borders to another country, so that people are not even able to move from the global south in any hope of seeking safe haven. So the question about who is a migrant, who is going to be under protection, is really, really important. Because you're right, there are people now saying, yeah, climate refugees, yeah, we should do something about them. You know who we like as those climate refugees? Oh, we like them really small islands. In the Pacific, there's only a few 100,000 of them. So we can say they are the climate refugees. Actually, the real climate refugees is Africa. The real climate refugees is Asia. When you look at the impacts of climate and climate impacts that are disproportionately affecting, people are talking about the whole of the Indian subcontinent and South Asia by the year 2100 for most people being unsustainable. In Pakistan last year, we had a heat wave which hit 53.5 degrees centigrade. At 54 degrees, it is impossible to be out in the open. It's 53.5 degrees. And this is a country where 4 out of 10 people face multiple poverty, where one pushes people from barely surviving into not surviving at all. And these are countries which deal with so many other issues at the same time in terms of poverty. And it's happening again and again, heat waves, and it's starting to impact Pakistan, India, Nepal, etc. And people look in terms of, when people say, so hold on a minute, I understand that there are people moving from Syria, but why are people moving from Pakistan? Why are people moving? It's because it is impossible to survive in more and more places around the world. And that's why our job, in terms of fighting around climate migration, is really important that we set up the parameters really, really wide. Because when this issue finally gets onto because it's nowhere on the political agenda, right? There is a UN compact going on at the moment. It's talking about, there's 2 compacts going on at the moment. One's on migration and one's on refugees. and it's going to come out with some findings. It's not going to be legally binding, it's not going to do anything, there'll be a lot of hot air. But it is starting to move things, there is starting to be a discussion, and our job is to keep that frame as wide as possible and not allow it to be narrow in this, because it is clear that whether we're talking about now or whether we're talking about a decade or so in the future, that the world will need more solidarity, more justice if we're going to tackle these global crises. And at the moment, I have to say, we as the progressive, as the left, are losing, because the people who are winning are the people who are saying that only answer to these issues is walls and fences and warships to push people back. And that's why our fight around climate refugees is in the trade union movement is a way of dragging the trade union movement into an area, but also dragging the environmental movement into an area and saying, this is really, really important. Yes, agree with all of this. And they will all say, yeah, climate refugee, that's all really, really good. And then for us to say, and the test is, what are we doing about Yarlswood? What are we doing about in this country, our government demonising and imprisoning people simply for seeking the right to safe haven? Because if that is not our litmus test, then all the talk that we have around climate migration simply becomes rhetorical.
Thank you very much.